This is Val from Bowerbox Press, and in this first part of this video I'm going to show you how to make covers for a double needle stitched book. This is an exposed spine sewing that opens all the way nice and flat so you can write inside. It has two discrete covers that are covered in decorative paper or cloth and sewn signatures inside. So this first video will show you how to prepare the covers for this book. The first thing you'll need is the paper for your text block. So I am using a 70-pound text commercial paper. It's pretty nice and thin, but thick enough to take some wet media if I wanted to do some ink washes. Ideally, you want your grain running vertically along the spine. So we're going to be folding this in half. The grain should be running with the spine this way. So these will be folded into signatures, but for now we just need one sheet folded in half for our size. You'll also need a piece of book board. This is Davy binder board. The grain also should be going the same direction as the spine, so whenever I buy a piece of board I mark on it which direction the grain goes, so I know that it's going vertically on this piece. The first thing you'll need to do is cut your book board down. So I've already cut this to the right height. Now to find the height, you want to take your single piece of folded paper that will be your text block, and you want to add a margin on three sides, so the top, the bottom, and the foredge. The folded edge should be lined up right against the edge of your book board here, and then you have your margin here, here, and here. I usually leave a little over 1/8 of an inch. You don't want to leave too much or it looks kind of awkward. Too little and your pages could stick out beyond the edge of the board. So just over 1/8 of an inch is ideal. So I'm going to mark this line here and then trim two pieces to the same size. And whenever you're cutting book board, you want to have a sharp knife and you'll make a couple of strokes to cut through the entire thickness of the board. You don't want to try to do it all at once. You want to make sure your knife is sharp. And I'm keeping my knife as vertical as possible instead of having it angled to one side or the other to try to make a nice straight cut. Now double check my measurement just to make sure that it cut square. Looks pretty good, so I can use this piece to measure my second board. I'm going to line it up on the left side, the top and the bottom, score a line, and then switch to my ruler for cutting the rest. So now I have my two pieces of book board. Should be exactly the same. You want to make sure they're nice and square. You can sand the edges a little bit to get rid of any burrs from cutting, but you want to keep your corners pretty square. Don't round off the corners unless that's part of your design. So my pages will fit inside here. I'll have a little bit of overhang of the cover on the top, the bottom, and the front side here. So I've chosen to cover this in old maps. So I have an old atlas page here. It's kind of a medium weight paper. It's not too thin and it's not too thick. It's great for making book covers. So I can lay this down and figure out where I want the map to end up on my front cover. I do want to have a margin for gluing the sides in. 3/4 of an inch is kind of the minimum margin that I like to have. An inch is ideal. You don't want less than that because you're going to be folding the sides of your paper over. You need to have enough to fold it over and glue it down securely. So I like to use one of my line gauges as a ruler. And I'm just going to cut out with a margin around my book board. So as you can see, I have a margin on all four sides to wrap the board over. I also need to cut off my corners so that when I fold the corners in, I don't have all this extra paper. So I'm going to flip this over. So I'm working on the back now. I'm going to trace around my board. This will also help when I'm gluing down. I'll know exactly where to put the board. But I'm going to cut off these corners at a 45-degree angle But I'm going to leave some space. I'm going to leave about the same thickness of the bookboard, maybe a hair more, between the corner of where my board will be glued, right here, and where I'm going to cut. So you can physically take your board, stand it on edge right at the corner, and then line your ruler up on the other side, so that when you're cutting at least one thickness of bookboard away from that corner. This will ensure that your corner isn't exposed, the bookboard doesn't peek out from the corner. And you can either eyeball it if you feel confident doing that, or actually use your bookboard to measure. But this is just a roughly 45-degree angle cut to remove that extra corner. So this will be my front cover, and I also need a piece to cover the inside of the bookboard. So I'm going to be using something from the atlas. This is just some text pages that I thought were kind of interesting. And I'm going to trim these so that I have about 3/16 of an inch margin inside. So this paper is going to be cut smaller. So again, I can trace right on my paper, and then I'm going to cut inside that line that I just drew by about 3/16 of an inch, so that this will end up being inside the edges of my bookboard. Now the sides of this will be exposed, so you want to make sure your cuts are nice and clean. So for each of your covers, your front and your back, you need your bookboard, your covering paper, trimmed to size with the corners cut off, and then something to cover the inside as well that's trimmed smaller, so you can see how this piece fits inside with a little bit of margin showing. So prepare both at once, cut your front and your back cover, and then we'll get started with gluing. I use Jade PVA. You can use any archival, or this is the Linico version. It's a neutral pH adhesive, designed for bookbinding. It's archival. So I usually pour out a little bit into a container, and if I need to thin it down, I can add a few drops of water to make it a little thinner. At this stage, you're going to need a bone folder and a glue brush. I also have a little pot of water along with my glue pot. You'll want some scrap paper to glue on top of. You don't want to get glue all over your cutting mat or your workstation, so grab a couple sheets of newsprint or copy paper or just scrap paper that you can glue on top of and then move out of the way. So we'll start gluing with our front cover. Now make sure that you are applying the glue to the inside that you don't want to be showing. I'm going to wet my glue brush and then kind of mix up the glue. My first step is to glue up inside that pencil outline that I made of my board. And whenever I'm gluing, I start in the center and work my way towards the edges. For this step, you don't need to glue all the way to the edge of your paper, but just make sure you go over that outline that you drew of where the bookboard is going to be. You want the entire surface that's contacting the flat side of the bookboard to be covered. And I'm always brushing the glue towards the edges instead of working my way in towards the center, starting at the center and working out. Try to get a nice even layer of glue. Make sure your corners and your edges are covered. And then since you have that outline traced on there, you can simply drop your bookboard right down into that outline. Now, if you get glue on your fingers, it's always handy to have something to wipe it off on, so keep a washcloth or a paper towel handy. I'm going to press this down, then flip the book over, and with my bone folder, start from the center and push out towards the sides to really burnish that paper down. Now, this may cause glue to ooze out on the other side, so you want to be mindful of that. I'm just smoothing out any air bubbles or any areas that the glue hasn't fully adhered to the board. Now flip this back over, and I'm going to start by folding in my tabs. So I usually start with one side or the top and bottom. Just try to be consistent whichever you decide to do. So I'll start with the long sides first. I always kind of work on one side of my scrap paper and move over. So I'm going to glue up this right-hand tab. One thing I want to be careful to avoid is having a big puddle of glue right at the corners. You may need to go back and kind of wipe any excess off with your glue brush. And then I flip this around, slide it over so it's not touching where that glue is on the scrap paper, and glue up the other tab. So I'm working 2 tabs at a time. I'm going to slide this over so that it's on a clean area of my paper. And using the pointed end of the bone folder, I'm going to lift this tab up, grab it, and pull up a little bit, and really run the bone folder against the side of the board. You want the paper to be glued to the side of the board, and then fold it down and kind of pull it towards the inside with your fingers as you burnish it down so that it's glued firmly to the side and then firmly to the face of the board. You should have a nice crisp 90-degree fold on each of those corners. Now you can see the corner here is sticking over. Since we had that extra space, the paper sticks over. I take the point of the bone folder and just push that in a little bit and then fold it down. So I take the point of the bone folder, push it in, and fold it down. So instead of coming straight across, it's going down a little bit. And what that will do when you fold this tab over, it will keep any paper from sticking off the top edge of your board here. So again, on the other side, I'm going to pull up, burnish it to the side of the board, and then pull it over and in and burnish it down to the face. So I'm making sure that everything is burnished down really firmly, and then I have a nice crisp edge on the board here. And the same thing with these corners. I'm going to take the point of the bone folder and squish the corner in and down. Same here, so squish it in and down. So if you can see that shape, instead of it continuing straight across, it's angled slightly down before it comes to this cut here. So now I'm ready to glue up my 2 side tabs. Again, making sure that I'm not applying a lot of glue in the corner. With that folded over corner tab, the glue likes to collect there, so you may need to remove some extra glue with your finger or the brush so that it doesn't ooze out. You want a nice even thin layer of glue on the entire tab and at the side of the board as well. So the same process for this. I'll take the point, I'm going to pull up on the tab, burnish it to the side of the board, and then pull it over and in and burnish down. And if I've smushed my corners properly, there shouldn't be any extra paper sticking off the side, kind of off the edge of the board. And if there's glue kind of oozing out, just carefully wipe it away. Again, pulling up to burnish the side, and then pushing down and pulling in towards the center. So you should be able to get nice crisp corners that don't stick over the edge. So before you start on your second board, you want to make sure you cover this side. You've introduced a lot of moisture to this side of the board with the glue, and if you just let this dry by itself, the board is going to curl. So we want to get the same moisture on both sides. So we're going to glue down our inside piece first before we move on to the second board. So this is my inside piece. You want to do a double check and just make sure it fits nicely. You're aiming to cover up any of the bookboard and any seams in the sides of your tabs that you folded in. So this will all get covered up. You can use any sort of paper you want. You can use the same as the front cover. You can use the same as your text weight paper inside. Anything that's similar to the weight of what you covered the front of your board with. So this entire piece will get glued up all at once. This can be a little difficult if your paper is thinner. It will want to kind of curl up and buckle. So put your fingers like a claw and you'll use the tips of your fingers or your fingernails to hold down so that the paper doesn't curl up. Again, you want to start with your glue in the middle and work it out towards the edges. So I usually glue up about half of it, and then I'll use my claw fingers and hold it down so that I can glue up the other half. You may need to go over this a couple of times and make sure that your edges and your corners don't start drying on you before you can get it glued down. And make sure it is completely covered in glue. Now, since there's glue all over my scrap paper, I'm going to carefully pick this up by one corner, get my scrap paper out of the way, and I'll flip this over, carefully line up the two top edges, corners, and then gently bring this down. You want to make sure that your margins are as even as possible. You can adjust it just a little bit, but once the glue starts making a bond, you won't be able to move the paper. So line it up as best you can on one edge first and then slowly paste it down. Again, take the bone folder and work from the center towards the sides. That will smooth out any air bubbles or any extra glue. If glue oozes out the sides while you're working, just simply wipe it off with your finger or a paper towel. So now I've covered both sides of this board. This should dry fairly flat as is, but I usually dry these under pressure. So I would put wax paper top and bottom and then put this in a book press or underneath something heavy until it's completely dry, or at bare minimum about 30 minutes. So you want this to be completely dry before you start binding your book together. So for this book, again, you'll need a front and a back cover, completely covered and glued up and dry before you start binding. So come back for part 2 and I will show you how to set up and prepare for the actual binding itself.